Hello, my name is Andy Binker-Cosen from 21 Stocks, and we're here today with Mr. James Brander, a professor at the Asia Pacific International Business and Public Policy Division at the University of British Columbia. He's been the president of the Canadian Economics Association and an editor of the Canadian Journal of Economics. He's published articles in the Journal of International Economics, the Canadian Journal of Economics, the European Economic Review, as well as the American Economic Review, where he published an important article in 1986, Oligopoly in Financial Structures, the Limited Liability Effect. He's developed the Brander-Spencer model in international trade along with Barbara Spencer, and recently in 2005 he published a book called Government Policy Towards Business. How are you today, Mr. Brander?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
We'll be speaking today about economic developments in Asia, so why don't we get started? Last Sunday, the capital reserve ratio for banks in China was raised for the fourth time this year to 20.5%, in yet another attempt by the government to put a lid on inflation. Do you think that these measures, along with the increased subsidies and the raise of the minimum wage, can actually curb inflation in China?
No. I think it's a starting point. At least the reserve ratio is a starting point. But I think China will have to take more aggressive action if they really want to cut inflation. Inflation in China is obviously becoming a fairly serious problem. And certainly increasing subsidies and increasing the minimum wage will do nothing to reduce inflation. They might help some of the individuals who are affected by inflation. But I think China will have to do more to restrain inflation as time goes on.
Okay, let's jump to Hong Kong, which is also in China. This week, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev visited Hong Kong, with which bilateral trade has grown 63% last year. Do you think that it's possible we see a Hong Kong-Russia financial alliance in the near future? I mean, Russia, for one, has expressed great interest in a new relationship of this sort. It's established a $10 billion fund to attract investment in this area. What's your opinion?
I think that we will see continued growth in bilateral investment flows between Russia and Hong Kong, for that matter between Russia and China more broadly. But I think it's very unlikely that we will see a specific meaningful alliance between Russia and Hong Kong. That would not be enthusiastically viewed by China, by the Chinese government, and even though Hong Kong is subject to a separate administration, it is, of course, part of Greater China. And secondly, I think that for Hong Kong, although Russia is important, the relationships with North America, the rest of Asia, and so on are more important. So while I expect to see continued growth in the relationship between Russia and Hong Kong, I don't think it will assume a special status.
Okay. The Taiwanese economy is very export-orientated, and it's diversified its trade partners throughout the years, as well as shifted its production from cheap, labor-intensive goods to more high-tech manufacturers. Having said that, do you think that Taiwan is too dependent on foreign trade and that the rise of other cheap labor markets in the region poses a threat to its long-term financial stability?
I think that Taiwan is in a somewhat vulnerable position, but I don't think that its economic strategy is the problem. The continuing tension between China and Taiwan is obviously an issue, and that political tension can certainly spill over into economic effects. Taiwan has experienced rapid economic growth, and it's natural when rapid economic growth occurs for a country to gradually move away from low-wage industries towards higher-end activities. So that's a natural development. That's what we've seen. So I don't see that as a problem. But as I said, I do think that Taiwan's position is somewhat vulnerable, largely because of the political issues vis-a-vis China. And as China becomes increasingly important economically, now the world's second largest economy, and probably in our lifetimes will become the world's largest economy, the relationship between Taiwan and China will become increasingly important.
Taiwan is one of the so-called Asian tigers, just like South Korea. South Korea was one of the few countries to avoid a recession during the 2007-2010 financial crisis. Some, like Newsweek's Michael Friedman and B.J. Lee, attribute this to President Lee Myung-bak's experience as the CEO of Hyundai. Do you agree with this idea?
I think it's too simple-minded, so no, I don't agree. I think that good government is important, of course. Good policy is important, and it's very important to have leaders who are able to implement effective policies, of course. But it's not just one person. In fact, the South Korean economy has been growing rapidly. It's got sound fundamentals. From the economic point of view, South Korea has had quite good governance. So it's more than one person. It's the structure of the economy and a long tradition of good economic management. Now, there are political problems, but at the economic level, I think South Korea just has a good institutional structure. So I think it's an oversimplification to attribute it to one person.
Now, the next question is in regards with Japan, and mainly because of the recent natural disaster, we send all the best wishes to the people of Japan, and hopefully that the situation can improve there. So regarding Japan, with the real GDP growth rates dropping in the country since the 1960s, the global financial crisis, and to top it all off, an earthquake, a tsunami, and a nuclear meltdown, could we see the fall of the Japanese economy?
Well, the Japanese economy has been declining in relative importance. It was recently eclipsed by China. China is now a bigger economy than Japan has, and Japan has had very lackluster growth in real living standards for the past couple of decades. So, things have not been going that well in Japan, and as you point out, the recent disasters, natural disasters, combined with not very good economic fundamentals, continue to be a problem. I don't think that Japan is going to disappear or go through a dramatic decline, but I think that it will continue to exhibit sluggish economic performance, and it will just probably continue in that way. It will be eclipsed increasingly by China and possibly by other developing or other rapidly improving economies as well. So I think I think Japan will continue to limp along, and it will continue to be a reasonably good place to live with a reasonably high standard of living. But I would not expect great things from the Japanese economy anytime soon.
What is it about the so-called Singapore model, where the state is heavily involved in the economy, that has made Singapore's economy so successful?
Yeah, Singapore is a very interesting case. Although there's one important aspect about Singapore that I think should be emphasized, and that is simply that it's small. I mean, Singapore is basically a city-state. It's small geographically. It's got a small population. It's in some ways easier to run than a large corporation. I think it's easier to run Singapore than it is to run General Motors. So that makes it possible for an enlightened government to actually operate effectively. If we're talking about a country like the United States or China or even Canada, there's no way a government could act the way the government in Singapore has acted. These other economies are just much too big and too complicated. In fact, within China, some of the cities are quite similar to Singapore. If you look at some of the city governments and what they've done, it's actually quite similar to what the government in Singapore has done. So basically, the government in Singapore treats itself like Singapore Inc. It's as if it's running a corporation, and that can work effectively. I think Singapore has had very good economic policy and very good economic performance. The government has made good decisions. I would not trust that model anywhere else. I wouldn't even trust it in Singapore for the future, but it's at least possible to have that Singapore Inc. model in an economy that's that small, with a high education level, with a lot of talented people, and with the good fortune to have had relatively good government. But all you need are a few bad leaders or just an economy that's too big and too complex to control, and then you're really in for trouble. So I think trying to follow the Singapore model would be a huge mistake for almost everyone, although I admit that Singapore itself is